a way to do it in so much that between this part of the room and that part of the room, there's no ability for the sound to traverse. You're basically making a void, or like you were saying, what was the word you said? Disruptive interference.
Yeah,
And it
destructive
would,
phase interference.
yeah, it wouldn't. The question I'd have is how how wide would it have to be in order to not allow the sound wave? Because let's say it's a really loud sound and it comes across this barrier. If the barrier is, and I say really loud in terms of the energy behind the sound wave. If the barrier was like a millimeter wide, that might not suffice. But maybe there's like an optimal
I mean, sound
thickness.
requires a medium, right? So if you can somehow create like a devoid of that medium or counteract that percussion of the medium,
Yeah,
right?
you
In
might
such
be.
a way that it matches the I don't know if I want to call it octave or harmonics, but however, uh yeah, if you could create some kind of sound deformation wave, then um
Yeah. And
technically yeah, you could
you wouldn't
nullify.
necessarily have to. Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily have to break, like completely block it. You could just get it to the point where whatever comes through is reducing decibels considerably and completely incoherent to the point where it doesn't make a difference. So you don't have to make it perfect. But oh, I had an idea and it dropped. What was the first thing you said?
uh like a percussive interference. It said that sound requires a medium. So
That's
if that
okay. I know what the idea
vibrational,
was. Yeah, you know that whole thing with plasma wind or ionic wind from like a plasma generator. What if you could use some of those principles? Maybe that might be a way to do it. Have you seen that stuff before?
no, no.
Okay. I might be making leaps, but I see lots of patterns
You said plasma wind.
and well, I mean, I might phrase it wrong. I think it's ionic wind, but it has something to do with some kind of plasma, or I might be mixing two videos together. But I saw this guy do a display with I think he used dry ice or something just to get the visual feedback. He had like this container rigged up to a static capacitor, and then he had one connected to the container and had like a bunch of smoke, and then another connected to his body. And when he point with his hand, it would literally disturb the smoke in the container. So maybe that's some way, like if you can get a coherent wind of that to disrupt the air, then perhaps the sound can't pass through. This is just like spitballing. It's the kind of thing you want to do with a whiteboard.
Yeah, no, I like all that kind of stuff. But yeah, you're right. We'd probably have to connect some dots here. But yeah, it's always fun.
Definitely more fun than spherical non-existence.
Yeah, it does kind of get old after a while, you know. Especially when you know, oftentimes the two people debating those positions don't really ever get to the ultimate implication of what's being said, you know, on either side if given, you know, their position's true. It's kind of the part that bothers me the most. It's almost like they're arguing just to argue, you know?
Yeah, it's like sparring with somebody who's made up his own kata forms and doesn't want you to spar with him. So what are we doing? Can I just shoot you in the head now? Can we move on? There used to be some class to it, right? Even to the point where people would do like a use not a coherent mockery of their opponent. So it wasn't as if that was their only argument. It was they would slip it in with their argument to make it fun, and there was some sportsmanship to it. And assuming you didn't devolve to your mum's a hoe kind of thing, it was entertaining for both parties, let alone the audience. But now you just got, I don't know, children throwing imaginary mud at each other. Here's something interesting though. I'm trying to see the interactions between light and air. It's talking about, additionally, air pressure can influence light. As the density of air increases with higher pressure, light travels more slowly through the denser medium. Now, obviously, you might quibble over the terms, but you could maybe use that as another principle to work with.
It would appear that if light will be bent by the air it goes through, then if you can manipulate the air such that it is vibrating, then it will distort the light in a slightly different way, causing presumably some quite interesting patterns. I'm not sure that would ever equate to you being able to cause one to kind of cancel out the other, but it would certainly have an effect on it.
Can you ever decrease the pressure while increasing the temperature and achieve like some stable state? Or vice versa?
Is that maybe? I don't know. Your question is not easy. But I had another question. Is there a way to draw in infrared? Like you could draw in like water or like a fluid medium. So let's say you had like a jet of water. It would eventually, after a certain distance, it would start dispersing from a fine jet to a wider jet. But if before it gets to that point, you could have something else sucking in the jet of water to basically make a continuous transaction between the emitter and the receiver of the water. Now, I'm using that as a visual. Could you do the same thing with infrared radiation? Do you think? Or is that a hard, hard question?
A laser works by trying to put the light in step with itself so that the same wavelength is transmitted throughout, so that it's coherent. You can do exactly the same thing with any wavelength. From the different sort of colors of laser, obviously. But if you try to do that with microwaves, you get a maser, which is microwave amplification, not light amplification. So there's no particular reason why you couldn't have a sort of an infrared laser. In fact, they probably do. However, even lasers will dissipate eventually.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking in terms of between an A and a B location. Let's just say, for argument's sake, because we're talking about the roof and the ceiling. No, sorry, the ceiling and the floor. If what you're
Or something on that. Like
say
you
that
said
again.
that the laser light will diffract ultimately, like, and that's obviously not in contention. But is there a point at which it doesn't diffract? And could could you refocus the light using some sort of like, I don't know, convex lens or something to reestablish the coherency of the light to further project it? Is that possible, Professor?
I don't know. I'm a historian, not a physicist. But in principle, yeah. If it's slightly bending outward, it's spreading, then a lens can cause it to unspread, just the same as it does with any other light. And
Well,
I
like
imagine
what I'm saying is the laser doesn't begin to diffract as it exits exits the aperture, if you will, of the end of the laser. Like it happens at a certain point,
I don't know
right?
as much. Okay, the effect of it will be absolutely minimal to start off with, if it's there at all. It will eventually become, undeniable that it is happening. I imagine that it begins pretty much immediately, but you really can't tell because it's
I mean that would be
mostly
the difference between coherent and incoherent light, right? That's the whole point of coherent light, right? Being that it's a single source a single source light, perturbation. And
Well, exactly. No, I mean coherent light simply means that all the individual sort of wavefronts are operating together at the same time and in the same direction, so that you get the same wavelength coming out the whole time. That's what's meant by coherent. Because normally, obviously, light is lots of different wavelengths, and even if you have red light and it's only red, it's red sort of randomly in all directions. We're sort of culminating all the light so that it is not only pointing in the same direction, but is also in step with itself. So that you've got a wavelength coming out that is kind of pure. As soon as it comes out of the barrel of whatever it is that's shooting it, it in theory should begin to expand, but it obviously with a laser, the distance after which you will notice it is rather larger than the distance that you would with a fluorescent light tube. So, I mean, there's nothing inherently stopping it from starting to spread immediately. There's nothing there. There's only
well,
the air around it. There's
I
nothing
mean, there's
physically
a
preventing it.
significant difference between red and blue light. But in terms of a laser, right, laser light, it's literally a point source light, which means that it's spatially coherent, which has another name as you call it sphere waves or plane waves or pinhole light, but I refer to it as point source light, which is coherent light. And coherent light is pretty simple. It's light which comes from a very small light source, and the light source is a single source, which is always coherent. And incoherence requires at least two different Cartesian sources. And since incoherence requires two sources, in phase emission causes the amplification of light, but doesn't cause the coherent light because the atoms generate light in phase with incoming light. So they'll amplify the light, but they amplify the incoherent light as well, and they don't make it coherent. The coherence of a laser light has another source, being that light has two main characteristics. It's monochromatic or very pure in frequency, which is called temporally coherent. And laser light has a point source characteristic of a sphere wave and plane wave, also called spatially coherent. So that's essentially what I was talking about. And like if you look at Dennis Gabbers, he invented holography before lasers existed, and to create a pseudo laser, he just took light from an ordinary mercury arc lamp and passed it through a pinhole. And Mercury's emission line made it nearly monochromatic, and the pinhole gave it its spatial coherence. So,
Well, a pinhole will generally cause things to spread. That's why pinhole cameras work. And we generally refer to a point light source as a light source that is a point out of which everything sort of radiates in all directions. Thus, a shadow is where you have a point light source and you get a light deficit when there's an object in between. So I'm not sure if I've ever heard anybody referring to a point light source in that way before.
Well, if you take
Not saying
like
you're wrong,
a
by the way, I've never heard it.
you take like a classroom helium neon lasers, they create spreading light, but the laser tube within a typical classroom laser contains of at least like one curved mirror called a confocal arrangement, and it creates the light in form of a spreading cone. So it's a little known fact that the manufacturers of these classroom lasers traditionally place a convex lens on the end of their laser tube in order to shape the spreading light into a parallel beam. I mean, while it's true that a narrow beam is convenient, I suspect that a part of their reason is to force the laser to fit our stereotype that all lasers produce a thin, narrow light beam. But the manufacturers could have saved some money by selling the real lensless laser tubes having a spreading beam. I don't think the customers would like that. But I believe that laser light is parallel light, but it's not. That isn't actually correct. So, like, if you look at like a laser in a CD player, and in like your laser pointers, they're semiconductor diode lasers. So they create that cone-shaped light beam. And if a parallel light beam is desired, then they require a focusing lens. And the same is true for lasers and the inexpensive laser pointers. They take part of an old laser pointer, and you'll find a plastic lens in front of the diode laser inside of it.
I think that kind of says what I said, which is that they'll generally kind of start spreading straight away, just not very much. However, when lasers were first invented back in 1960, whatever it was, you had a ruby crystal, which was basically a rod, say 6 inches long, mirrored at one end, semi-mirrored at the other end, and a flash tube. And impregnated in that ruby was, I think, probably chromium or something. Doesn't really matter exactly what it was. But as you pumped sort of energy into it, the light would bounce between the two mirrors. Because the tube itself is essentially a tube, so the sides are parallel. Eventually the light would basically become parallel, because it's just bouncing between 2 points. Eventually it would retain enough energy to be able to go through the semi-mirrored surface in what was functionally a straight line. And whilst eventually you would notice that it was spreading. In fact, if you hadn't set it up correctly, you'd have a. In fact, think of it. If you projected it against a wall, what you should see is a kind of pink surrounding with a red dot in the middle, and that red dot in the middle is the light lasing. The stuff around it is spread. But that little dot in the middle was absent. It meant that you'd made a very, very expensive fluorescent light tube, and it wasn't lasing at all. But the central, for want of a better word, mass of the light emitting from the end of the tube was pretty much parallel, simply by means of the way it was produced. Now, what they do commercially now in order to make it cheaper, because nobody builds lasers out of 6-inch ruby rods anymore. I have no idea. And they may well behave differently, but that's why they were parallel initially.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. When it's first turned on, it'll fluoresce, and then it emits light, which is not coherent and different from random light waves. They start out from different parts of the laser, and after a few thousand mirror bounces, all the light waves have added and subtracted to form just a single or point source EM emission, I guess, is how it would be. referred to, but yeah, I would suspect that it'd probably be pretty costly to do that with a 6-inch ruby rod.
Oh, it was. I really, really, really wanted to build one when I was at school, but I didn't have the spare sort of £6,000 to £8,000 or dollars that I would have needed to just buy the rod, let alone figure out how the rest of it worked. I mean, it was a nice thought at the time, but 11-year-old me really, really didn't know how to do that. Come to think of it, million-year-old me doesn't know how to do that now either, but there you go. I'm not sure, though, that you could use it to sort of cancel out sound. I'm not sure how that would work at all.
Can anybody hear me? All right.
I can.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I had to disconnect.
Didn't notice, but welcome back.
So you went into history, huh?
Yeah. Long, long, long time ago.
Do you agree with the mainstream narrative in terms of humanity's historical origins?
Not entirely sure what the historical narrative is. I happen to have been thinking about that recently, and there are certain things about the past that are incontrovertibly true, in the sense that, people lived, they breathed, they ate, they drank, they made merry, occasionally reproduced, left behind a dead body and maybe some other stuff. We weren't born with tools in our hands or words in our mouths, so there was a time before anything that we have, there was a time before we had it. That seems to me to be fairly unequivocal. Now, it's been it has become kind of vogue to question even some of those things. But if it was a simulation and we were only made last week, those aren't really meaningful questions for a historian. Philosopher maybe, physicist perhaps. Historian, if you proved it was true, would shrug and say, well, we've only got what we've got. And I suppose that's true. The trajectory of development from the use of what we had around us, wood, other plant material, stones, and not much else, through the use of stone to the basic use of metal to more complex use of metal, seems to me to be fairly well established, but it's also difficult to see how you could have done it otherwise. Because, unless you sort of plead some special intervention where like aliens turned up and gave us something, or gods gave it to us or something, once again, there was a time, whatever we have, there was a time before we had it. So, that trajectory of stone to, I don't know, metal to bronze to iron is, it's not just a pipe dream. It's difficult really to see how else you could do it. You don't generally end up with things that are more complex happening before things are less complex. But
not entirely. Like if you look at a lot of the megalithic sites discovered around the world, it seems as if the construction became more intricate the further back they go, meaning that the more modern developments built above the megalithic sites are less intricate, and the engineering isn't as good, just to plainly put it. They used way larger stones with more precision, so it seems the further back we go, humanity had some other understanding, and which could indicate, a loss of information, possibly some sort of a reset, if you will. But mean, that's just speculative, but the fact of the matter is the further down and the further back we go, the precision only increases.
Well, you see, the problem is that all you've done there is push it further back. There was a time before those people had what it is that they had. They had to work it out. So we might not have the specific detail of it, because maybe it's completely lost, but there was a time before they had it. And if something happened and we inherited to a degree what they had, ultimately we would have had to relearn it because they weren't there to tell us about it. We only have the remnants of what was left behind. So once again, the same basic trajectory is still basically in place. You end up with people who found artifacts which they couldn't comprehend, eventually learned how to work stone, maybe one day worked how to work stone as well as they did, but then came metal, then came, more complex use of metal, and then came, if you like, that's as far as the Romans. It's not really that sort of difficult to see why it would have had to have happened in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm necessarily arguing the progression of humanity like is depicted throughout the eras, but as much as I am like, I guess more of the origin, right, of humanity is depicted through the mainstream model. I mean, I don't know, where you want to go with that, if that leads us to evolution or what have you, but it just seems like there's a lot of inconsistencies and incongruencies as depicted by the mainstream following, some of the evidence, I guess.
Would you? I'm curious. In a way, I tend to sort of start looking at history at the point at which we definitely were people. Some people like to start a lot earlier than that and think about evolution, and some, obviously, some people believe that we were created as we are. Either way, I tend to start with the as we are, because going back further than that becomes increasingly speculative, beyond the basic facts that people existed and there must have been a time before they had what they had. So I don't know what to say about that. But if you wouldn't mind giving me an example of something that you feel is an inconsistency, then I'd be happy to think about it.
Well, I mean, the premise, I guess, of that whole mainstream model, I guess, projects life spontaneously emerging from innate matter, which is nowhere witnessed, right? Merely a projection used to assert, the whole evolutionary cycle to begin with. But so I guess you kind of would have to follow that narrative to get to the origin of humanity if you were to go with that understanding, which seems like you exclude that for some reason, yet still accept everything else, which is interesting. I mean, that's fine, but just seeing where you draw the line, I guess.
I just think that the origin in that respect is not a particularly kind of fruitful or meaningful question for a historian who is dealing with kind of actual artifacts and remains that are actually dug up and documents and which are much later and stuff like that. It's just, for me personally, I just don't find it a particularly useful avenue of study for a historian. From what you've described, there appear to be a couple of different ideas in the mainstream, and two ideas overall. One is that we evolved, the other is that we didn't. And beyond trying to establish one of those, which might be a fruitful area of study, it's difficult to reconcile the two very well. However,
you don't think, depending on which side of the fence you're on, could maybe sway your the what is it, the hysteresis, or the truth behind the narrative of the history you accept?
I'm not really sure. Personally, I have come from a very religious background, and I feel the Bible, for example, tells us that we were created, and I see no particular reason to think that we definitely weren't. So I tend I personally tend to start from the point at which we exist for that reason. That's why I've chosen that point, because before that, if nothing else, we weren't people, and either that or we just didn't exist at all. So now you know why I tend to start from the point of view of something that's already there. I, in my early years, will simply have followed the biblical narrative and said, well, okay, prior to the flood, society could have advanced quite significantly. And we know that obviously the flood would have provided, as you call, quite a reset, and that you would not expect the same level of technology and the same knowledge and etc. to have existed afterwards. And if you feel that that's the way in which the evidence seems to present itself, that we had potentially very advanced technology followed by not very advanced technology post some sort of reset, then that would correspond tolerably well to that narrative. Now, once you come out after the flood, there are things that you would have had beforehand that you maybe had knowledge of but didn't physically have anymore. And to a certain extent, people would have had to have started again, not completely from scratch, but would still have had to have started again. So, that those two narratives collide quite well. Doesn't collide very well with the other narrative of us being evolved and there was no flood, and that's not the same at all. But I'm open to the idea that people are able to do things and then they weren't able to do things, because that's happened many times throughout history, although not to that extent. It happens all the time. I mean, went to the moon in 1969. Good luck building a Saturn V rocket now. Good luck building a Model T Ford now. Good luck building the pyramids in the same way in which they did now, even if we did know. We have our own ways of doing things, and presumably we'll be able to do them, but we won't be able to do them in the same way. Technology is lost to us. We just don't know how some of these things worked. Obviously, we can find out.
Isn't it the outcome that's important, not necessarily the means at which you approach it?
Not sure what you mean.
I'm saying that, like, you were given plenty of examples of things that can't be recreated due to the methods by which have been lost due to the testament of time. But what I'm saying is, isn't it the outcome of which it is you're setting out to achieve, not necessarily the approach at which you achieve it? It's like you gave the example of the Model T car, and maybe we don't have all the lathes and dies and the mechanics at which existed at that time that created that Model T. However, with today's innovation and ingenuity, we could produce a Model T exactly the same as it was first created. It's not necessarily the means at which you produced it, rather the similarity of the outcome. So if they're both identical, then they're identical. I mean, does it really matter if we have the same method to get to that identical thing it is we're setting out to create to begin with? I guess, I don't know, I feel like I'm talking in circles.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. And I don't know that we can produce something that's identical unless you do it in the same way. Otherwise, it sort of pretty much wouldn't be identical. We'd be able to produce something that did the same, looked the same, and functioned in a same way. I mean, the internal combustion engine has changed a lot, but I'm sure we could produce one that was, if you, for want of a better word, unevolved, a very basic model. And I'm sure we'd be able to fit it to a chassis which we could build, even if we had to sort of build it by hand because we don't have, as you say, all the workshop for it. And the Model T Ford was not all that long ago. And we still have examples of it knocking around that we could copy. We would be able to produce the pyramids. I mean, what's more easy than piling stones on top of each other, really? It's a very stable structure. There's no particular reason why.
That's the problem. We can't. We can't do that today.
Well, we could. We just don't. I mean, to start off with, to a certain extent, there's really no point. I mean, why would anybody want to? It'd cost a bomb. I'm sure there are more interesting things to spend the money on, but ultimately, it is a pile of stones, which is
you're missing,
downplaying it slightly, but that is what it is.
You're missing the premise before it being a pile of stones. You're missing the foundation at which those stones are placed upon. Right? So
on the ground,
when you,
aren't they just placed on the ground? I mean, or like any foundation, you can dig down a bit. I mean, what?
I mean, like you go to the. You said you're a biblical man, or at least raised to be, but like there's a whole analogy in that. The guy that builds his house upon a solid foundation versus the guy that builds his house upon sand. There's going to be two different outcomes in the durability and longevity of those homes. I'm sure you remember that story, right?
Yes. I mean, what exactly are they built on?
So what I'm telling you is that if you're to understand that 90% of what's there in ancient Egypt is subsurface, then it throws off the whole depiction of, men physically stacking stones rather than some sort of like antiquitech, if you will.
Subsurface now. Not sure that some of it was necessarily subsurface at the time.
90% of ancient Egypt is subsurface. Yes, what you see on the surface is 10% of what's all there, which throws off the whole timeline, the whole possibility of men stacking stones in such a way, given, like I said, the conditions. I mean, what is that place? What's the composition of that? Is it like a sub-Saharan desert? It's it's not bedrock, is it? I mean, if you were to go build right now, stack those stones on sand, you think that you're going to have the same outcome and recreate what they created without having a solid foundation? I don't think so.
Not sure I'd be daft enough to try to just pile it on sand. And I'm pretty sure that whatever is underneath it is stable enough to hold it. All we can say about it for certain is that when you actually look at it, you have great big blocks of stone piled on top of each other. Now, whilst that is a little bit kind of demeaning to say it in that way, functionally, that is all it is. You have to have some knowledge about what was underneath, some notion of stability, some notion of trying to, ensure that it wasn't going to collapse. And of course, there are pyramids that did. There are part pyramids and things that show us that, these things didn't just start out looking like that. They, developed that way over a number of different builds, and some of those builds don't exist anymore because they weren't stable. It was an extraordinary accomplishment. I wouldn't want to say it wasn't. But if I had sufficient money and was mad enough and said to someone, right, let's build a pyramid, I'm pretty sure we'd be able to do it. I mean, why wouldn't we? It essentially, it's just a great big Lego set. And, all right, maybe not just a Lego set. But ultimately, that's kind of what it is. And there's nothing wildly crazy about it. It's a crazy accomplishment.
I'm just saying, you're talking about one simple little pyramid, which seems like it is, but there's more to that pyramid than meets the eye. So if you factor all of that in, Yeah, if you're to factor all that in, right? And then
Yes,
and
it's
and
basically
and, and
3D printed, isn't it?
what's that?
Well, if you're just doing it layer by layer, which seems possible, ultimately you're sort of 3D printing it using stone blocks as your base material and incorporating within it different stone some of the time in order to get, granite chambers and things like that. I can't imagine sort of building a 3D printer big enough to print it, but that's the analogy, I suppose.
Have you ever seen any of these megalithic sites that are built from solid rock from the inside out?
Not sure what you mean by from the inside out.
So you've got different, types of construction. You can build, as you put it, stacking, blocks or whatnot. But they've got pyramids if that are built from the inside out. They took a giant solid rock and carved within it and literally built a pyramid from the inside out of a solid rock, solid foundation already existing.
Well, that would be in some respects even easier because you don't have to worry about building it in the first place. You're just hewing out the rock in much the same way in which you hollow out a, I don't know, pumpkin.
Transportation would be so much easier.
Yes, because you're only taking stuff away, and in smaller quantities and masses. I mean, you don't have to take 100 tons in one go. I see the megalithic structures. Obviously, they are huge, and they're beyond in scope anything that we would ever really attempt to do today. I think there are reasons why we don't do it, and I think for some extent they're silly reasons, but they still exist. And
More modern time, like Coral Castle by Lee Sullivan over in the coast of Florida. He built this fairly large structure with large 9-ton stones. I think he's got a door that pendulates off of like a 1914 Ford wheel bearing that's about 9 tons, and it's perfectly balanced to the point where a 3-year-old child could push the door open. And he did this as a single individual using some sort of, I don't know, means by which conventional physics doesn't really comport with. So
well, I mean, what you've just done is say that he had access potentially to technology that we don't understand for whatever reason or whatever means. That, and I've already established that whatever means it is that the ancients used to build, for example, the pyramids, we would probably struggle to do it in the same way unless we do exactly what they did. And even then, it might be hard work. And we've already pointed out that, yeah, we could probably do it, but we'd probably do it differently. So there's not really a contradiction there. We just, there are things that we don't know about the past. We weren't there to see it. They didn't record it particularly well.
it's the timeline it's the timeline, right? That I'm kind of going with, like, and the amount that's actually there. The amount that's actually there would throw off the timeline and the required manpower.
I can compare it only with things that I know that have been built since in their scope and consider the manpower involved with those. Same with anyone. It's always easy to say, but yes, they had millions of slaves or thousands and thousands of slaves. And
Some
we
of
do
these,
know that many hands make light work,
Well, yeah, but you can't fit 1 million slaves in a 10-foot diameter. You know what I'm saying? So no matter how you want to manipulate that, it's physically
That's why I think
impossible to put 1 million hands on a single object.
It's why, well, I'm not sure you'd need to, but it's why I think that to a certain extent it's a bit of a cop-out. Yeah, that would certainly help, having lots of slaves involved with moving things. You wouldn't need to have them all touching it. If you're pulling it or pushing it along on a sled of some sort, you could do that. I'm pretty sure we
Some
can
of
do that
these,
now.
yeah,
But
some of these
things like
regions of time that are, under discussion, some of these nebulous regions of times are spanning decades. So they got not only manpower but decades to work with. So
yeah, they're generational projects, for sure. They thought on a big scale, not just a big scale for today, but a big scale for tomorrow and years
Yeah,
to
but I don't
come.
know. Maybe Doofus came in late, but I'm addressing subsurface, like the 90% of what's there. I'm not talking about the 10% that mainstream accounts for, but the entirety of it, which throws off the timeline and the manpower to begin with.
I mean, if the man hours you've got to work with, if that's over the course of, for a particular, uh, leadership structure, those leadership structures lasted for hundreds of years. So we're talking about man hours that could easily exceed the billions. So I don't know, man.
Well, so you're saying it's feasible if we're to assume that what we are accounting for on the surface is only 10% of what's actually there. You're saying it's feasible, given enough time and manpower, to still fit within the given projection of what took place.
The man hours available is astronomical. So yeah, a lot of it is possible.
I don't know.
Mainstream hasn't got a particular sort of reason to fit things into a specific time frame. When you're talking about something that thinks in terms of evolutionary timescales,
How
you've
many
got
humans do you
hundreds,
think existed at these
thousands
time
of years.
periods, bro? We got these sites all over the place, dude. That would have had to have been like millions and millions of people existing, dude. Which I don't know. It just seems like you guys' timelines are off and the whole story's off. If we're
Again,
to go with
I'm
that.
not sure. I'm not sure why you think the mainstream needs to fit it into a particular timescale. Um, in fact, if anything, the notion of creation happening only, say, 6,000 years ago squeezes things into a timescale. And early history um, tended to try and follow that timescale. But actually, once you take away that restraint and say that mankind's endeavors go back not just a couple of thousand years to, tens or even hundreds of thousands, um, so long as there was somebody established in that area who at least started doing something, they got all the time in the world. And I don't know how long they took, and it would be remiss of me to say that would have only taken 50 years or whatever, unless there is a particular reason for thinking that it was established by a particular person and that it happened within their lifetime. That would cause you a constriction of time. But then that comes down to sort of motivation and manpower. But
Well,
for any individual project, that shouldn't pose a problem. For massive numbers of projects, it would potentially be more of a problem.
there's
But
an
for many of them,
analogous
squeeze it.
Yeah, there's an analogous situation. Like in some of these third world countries, you got families who have their houses, and they look a certain way, and then during the lifetime of that generation, they're added upon, built upon, and then on the next generation, the house now looks like something different, and then that generation starts building upon it. These houses are here long enough to totally transform from one thing to another thing, and that's on a shorter time scale than what's available for these older structures that we're looking at now.
don't know. I mean, there's towns that have been there before the day of Christ, which haven't changed a single bit. I mean, granted they're protected, but right across from that, you've got a whole village that's existed for hundreds of years, if not thousands, like in Italy, for example. You've got villas that were built over a millennia ago that maintain their traditional heritage of design and what's the word I'm looking for? Just construction. We'll just leave it at that. Pretty cool, actually, because you can
It's
buy
stone,
some
though,
of these
right?
places for $1, as long as you're willing to keep them updated, like in terms of not falling apart. But
So I just
yeah,
jumped in. Are you guys talking about the Tartarian Empire?
no, not necessarily, at least.
I would hazard a guess that most of those things were made of stone, which is really durable. And you build something out of stone, it's built to last. I mean, I come from a little city in the bottom right-hand side of England. We have buildings there that are over 1,000 years old. The cathedral in Rochester is, I think it's 12th century, sort of built in the early 1100s. Still in use. I mean, it doesn't look exactly the same as it did when it was built, but it is still in use. So they redecorated a bit during the Gothic period, and halfway down you've got arches that are half Norman and half Gothic, which is kind of crazy. They ran out of money and weren't able to finish refurbishing the interior fully. So the front of it's Norman. On the other side of the road there's a castle, 100 feet tall, the main structure of which is largely intact. It's not in use anymore, hasn't been since a little after the Peasants' Revolt of about 1381, I think that was. But like all castles, they tended to fall out of use once you started having cannon that would, smash through walls. So they're
Imagine taking
strategic
a metal
advantage.
detector through that place.
Could be interesting, but I don't think it was ever subject to that. I think they stopped using it before. Every time it was ever successfully stormed was because somebody opened the gates and let them in. But anyway, yeah, 1,000 years old. And if you go and have a look at it, you'll see that it's made of blocks of stone. It's all nicely squared off. And yes, there is mortar, which is made from gravel, if you like, taken from the local river. We know this because it's got the shells and things in it that you'd expect. There's not huge gaps in between things. It was well built. The fact that the cathedral is still in use and not falling down is evidence of the fact that it was very well done. Now, I couldn't tell you exactly how long it took to build it, but those projects tended to take somewhere in the region of 50 to 70 years. It's only one building. Well, two buildings, castle and a cathedral. But, they had the manpower for it. To build a 100-foot high structure, which also had a wall, and the city also had a wall around that too. The Romans had a wall around it when it was a bit smaller and Roman. But 1,000 years later, Normans. So it's sometimes it's worth just considering what can be achieved by a lot of determined people if they really put their mind to it, and it's meaningful to them. They really want to get it done. It's rather different in today's culture where things are not meaningful to people. They don't care as long as they get paid, and sometimes they don't even care then. So you expect better workmanship to start off with because they care about it, and they, I guess, had nothing else to do to a certain extent anyway. Maybe that was a silly thing to say. People always have other things to do, but